Narrator Stories from the Dark presents Beneath the Surface. The following audio documentary examines a case that has perplexed investigators, scientists, and witnesses alike. What you're about to hear includes interviews with survivors, experts, and those closest to the events. Some names have been changed to protect identities. Listener discretion is advised. In the chaotic aftermath of the Soviet Union's collapse, Moscow transformed from the capital of a superpower to the epicenter of a wild frontier of capitalism, crime, and political reinvention. It was against this backdrop of uncertainty and opportunity that a series of events unfolded in the winter of 1994, events that would remain buried in obscurity, yet shape the trajectory of power in modern Russia for decades to come. This is the story of the Neva Apartments murders, a case that disappeared from official records almost as quickly as it emerged, leaving behind only whispers, fragments of evidence, and a trail of inexplicably deceased witnesses. February 1994. Moscow was experiencing one of its coldest winters on record. The temperature had remained below minus 25 degrees Celsius for 3 consecutive weeks. Power outages were common. Food shortages had citizens standing in bread lines reminiscent of Soviet times, and in the luxury Neva Apartments complex on Kutuzovsky Prospect, a residence favored by the emerging political and business elite, something terrible was about to unfold. Dmitri Volkov, my name is Dmitri Volkov. In 1994, I was a detective with the Moscow Criminal Police. Not a good time to be in law enforcement. We had no resources, little authority, and the city was overrun with organized crime. Many of my colleagues had quit to work security for the oligarchs or the mafia. Sometimes it was hard to tell the difference. But I stayed. I believed in justice, even when justice seemed to have abandoned Russia. I was assigned to patrol the Western District, which included several of the new luxury developments where the new rich lived. On February 17, 1994, at approximately 4:17 a.m., we received a call about a disturbance at the Neva Apartments. The caller didn't identify themselves, just said there were sounds of struggle coming from the penthouse apartment, Unit 1201. Narrator: the Neva Apartments building had been completed just 8 months earlier, a testament to the rapid privatization and wealth creation that characterized post-Soviet Russia. The 12-story building featured marble lobbies, 24-hour security, and amenities unheard of during communist times. The penthouse apartment, spanning the entire top floor, belonged to Mikhail Baranov, a former mid-level KGB officer who had, through various private ventures, amassed significant wealth in the early 1990s. Dmitri Volkov, when we arrived at the scene, the security guard initially refused to let us enter. Said we needed authorization from above. I had to physically push past him to access the elevator. This was common then. Private security often acted like they were above the law. When we reached the 12th floor, the door to apartment 1201 was slightly ajar. There was no response to our calls, so we entered with weapons drawn. What we found inside: I've been a police officer for over 2 decades, but I've never seen anything like it before or since. Narrator: according to the initial police report, the scene inside the penthouse apartment defied conventional understanding of what was physically possible. Dmitri Volkov, the apartment had been transformed into what I can only describe as a slaughterhouse. 3 bodies were found, all male, all displaying signs of extreme physical trauma. But the distribution of blood and evidence made no sense. The blood spatter patterns were, I don't have the words for it. It was as if the victims had been attacked by something that could defy gravity. Blood droplets moved in arcs and patterns that our forensic experts later said were impossible under normal physical conditions. One victim was found in the living room, another in the study, and the third in the master bedroom. All 3 appeared to have been running from something, but here's where it gets truly bizarre. All 3 men had died from identical wounds. Their throats had been cut with surgical precision, but there were no defensive wounds on their hands or arms. No signs of struggle. And based on the blood evidence, all 3 had been killed simultaneously despite being in different rooms. Narrator: the victims were identified as Mikhail Baranov, the apartment's owner, Viktor Kozlov, a business associate, and Sergei Naumov, a mid-level official from the mayor's office. All three men were connected to St. Petersburg's political scene, having worked alongside members of the administration that would eventually form the core of Vladimir Putin's inner circle. However, none of them were particularly high-profile individuals at the time. Elena Petrova, I'm Professor Elena Petrova, former head of forensic science at Moscow State University. In 1994, I was brought in as an external consultant on this case due to its unusual characteristics. What we found defied explanation. The blood spatter analysis suggested that the force used to cut the victims' throats came from multiple directions simultaneously, as if the killer had somehow attacked from in front of and behind the victims at the same time. Even more puzzling were the footprints. We found what appeared to be a single set of bloody footprints leading away from each victim, but they didn't match any known footwear. They resembled bare feet, but the pressure distribution was wrong, as if whoever or whatever made them was significantly lighter than a human should be. And most disturbing of all, these footprints walked directly to the nearest walls and then stopped. Not to doors or windows, directly to solid walls. Narrator: the investigation was immediately complicated by jurisdictional issues. Within hours of the discovery, officials from the Federal Security Service, the FSB, successor to the KGB, arrived on scene and attempted to take control of the investigation. Dmitri Volkov, a team of 6 FSB agents, arrived less than 3 hours after we discovered the bodies. They showed paperwork indicating the case was being classified as a matter of state security. They ordered us to turn over all evidence and leave the premises. I refused. This was clearly a homicide, which fell under our jurisdiction. The lead FSB agent, a man named Leonid Stepanov, took me aside and said something I've never forgotten. He said, "Detective Volkov, what you found here isn't a murder. It's something much worse. For your own safety and the safety of your family, walk away." But I didn't walk away. I insisted on maintaining police jurisdiction, at least until a formal transfer order came through proper channels. The FSB team reluctantly agreed to allow us 24 hours to process the scene before they took over. Narrator: that 24-hour window would prove crucial. During this time, Detective Volkov and Professor Petrova documented evidence that would later disappear from official records. Elena Petrova, the most significant finding, was a symbol drawn in blood on the ceiling of each room where a victim was found. It resembled a circle with what appeared to be Cyrillic letters arranged around it, but they weren't modern Cyrillic. They appeared to be Old Church Slavonic, a much older form of the script. The symbols were identical in each room, drawn with extraordinary precision despite being on the ceiling, something that would be very difficult for a person to do, especially in the midst of a violent crime. We photographed these symbols and sent copies to a linguistics expert at the university. But before we received any analysis, all our photographs and documentation were confiscated by the FSB. Narrated: the following day, as promised, the FSB officially took control of the investigation. Detective Volkov and his team were ordered to surrender all evidence, notes, and personal observations related to the case. But Volkov had taken the precaution of securing certain key pieces of evidence. Dmitri Volkov, I knew something wasn't right. The way the FSB responded was disproportionate for what should have been a standard homicide investigation, even one involving people with political connections. So I kept copies of key photographs and made detailed personal notes that I hid in my apartment. I also secretly recorded my conversation with one of the victim's colleagues, who came to identify Naumov's body. The man's name was Alexei Kuznetsov. He worked with Naumov at the mayor's office in St. Petersburg before they both moved to Moscow. When he saw Naumov's body, he turned white. Not the normal reaction of shock you'd expect, but like he'd seen something he recognized and feared. He whispered, "It's happening again," before composing himself. When I questioned him later, he denied saying it, but I have it on tape. Narrator: Kuznetsov's statement would take on significant importance as Volkov continued his unofficial investigation. But within days, the case took another disturbing turn. Dmitri Volkov, 4 days after the murders, I was informed that the case had been officially closed. The official report stated that the three men had died in a business dispute gone wrong, and that the perpetrator, an unnamed Chechen militant, had been apprehended and killed while resisting arrest. No body was ever produced. No evidence supporting this story was ever shared, and all physical evidence from the crime scene, including the bodies themselves, was confiscated and never seen again. Most disturbing of all, the Neva Apartments building management claimed that there was no apartment 1201. They insisted the building had only 11 floors. When I went back to check, the elevator indeed only went to the 11th floor. It was as if the entire penthouse had vanished overnight. Narrator, what followed was a systematic erasure of not just the evidence, but any record that the victims had ever existed. Their names disappeared from official databases. Their apartments were occupied by new tenants who claimed to have lived there for years. Former colleagues denied knowing them. It was as if history itself was being rewritten. But Detective Volkov wasn't willing to let the case go. He began a personal investigation that would span decades and ultimately cost him nearly everything. Dmitri Volkov, I started by tracking down Alexei Kuznetsov. He had abruptly quit his job at the mayor's office and disappeared. It took me weeks to locate him at a dacha outside Moscow. When I confronted him, he was terrified, clearly drinking heavily. He kept checking the windows, the doors. He initially refused to speak to me, but eventually, after several vodkas, he began to talk. He told me that what happened at the Neva Apartments wasn't an isolated incident. He claimed there had been a similar event in St. Petersburg in 1992 involving the same phenomenon. He wouldn't elaborate on what he meant by phenomenon, just kept saying it's not human and they can control it. When I pressed him on who they were, he mentioned a name that surprised me, Vladimir Putin, who at that time was just beginning his rise through the St. Petersburg administration. According to Kuznetsov, Putin and a small group of former KGB officers had discovered something during the collapse of the Soviet Union, something that had been kept hidden in a secret research facility outside Leningrad. He didn't know what it was exactly, just that it could be directed at targets and would eliminate them in ways that defied explanation. He believed this weapon, or whatever it was, had been used against political and business rivals multiple times during the chaotic period of the early 1990s, with the murders disguised or erased from records. Narrator Kuznetsov's claims, if true, would implicate future Russian President Vladimir Putin in a series of extraordinary assassinations years before he rose to national prominence. However, verifying these claims proved impossible. 2 days after speaking with Detective Volkov, Alexei Kuznetsov was found dead in his dacha, the official cause listed as alcohol poisoning, despite the fact that the autopsy showed his blood alcohol level was relatively low. Elena Petrova, I attempted to analyze the blood spatter photographs that Detective Volkov had preserved. The patterns were unlike anything in forensic literature. They suggested forces that simply shouldn't exist in normal physics. The directionality of the blood indicated that the victims' throats had been cut by something moving at extraordinary speed, almost too fast for the human eye to perceive. But what troubled me most were the symbols on the ceiling. I managed to consult privately with a linguistics colleague who specialized in ancient Slavic languages. He identified them as a variant of Old Church Slavonic, but with elements that predated even that. The arrangement was similar to certain protective wards found in pre-Christian Slavic traditions. Except these weren't protective symbols, they were the opposite. My colleague described them as invitation glyphs, symbols meant to open a doorway for something to pass through. 3 weeks after our consultation, my colleague died in what was reported as a hiking accident. His body was never recovered. Narrator, as Volkov continued his investigation, he began to uncover connections to a secret Soviet research program that had allegedly operated from the 1960s through the 1980s. Dmitri Volkov, through various contacts in the former KGB, I learned about something called Project Zerkalo, Mirror in English. It was supposedly a psychic research program, similar to what we now know the Americans were doing with their remote viewing programs, but with a significant difference. The Soviet program wasn't just trying to gather intelligence, they were attempting to weaponize psychic phenomena. According to my sources, in the late 1970s, researchers in a facility outside Leningrad made a breakthrough. They discovered a method to manifest what they called a shadow entity, something that existed partially in our world and partially in somewhere else. This entity could reportedly move through solid objects, exist in multiple locations simultaneously, and execute precise physical actions under the control of specially trained operators. The project was allegedly shut down in 1982 after an incident where the entity killed several researchers and couldn't be contained. The official records were destroyed, and the surviving researchers were reassigned to distant postings across the Soviet Union. But some of the research materials and possibly the containment apparatus for the entity reportedly went missing during the chaos of the Soviet collapse. Narrator, while this information came from sources Volkov considered reliable, no documentation has ever surfaced to confirm the existence of Project Zerkalo. However, scattered throughout Soviet archives are references to unexplained budget allocations for a special psychological research initiative that received significant funding during the period in question. Elena Petrova, the scientific community, largely dismisses phenomena like psychic abilities or manifestations as pseudoscience. However, during the Soviet era, significant resources were devoted to researching fringe concepts, particularly those with potential military applications. These programs operated under extreme secrecy. What makes Detective Volkov's information compelling is that the blood evidence from the Neva apartment's murders exhibited characteristics that align with his description of this shadow entity. The victims appeared to have been attacked simultaneously in different rooms. The footprints stopped at solid walls. The precision of the fatal wounds suggested something moving with superhuman speed and accuracy. From a purely scientific perspective, I cannot explain what killed those three men. What I can say with certainty is that it wasn't a conventional human attacker. Narrator, in 1996, as Vladimir Putin's political career began to accelerate following Boris Yeltsin's re-election, Detective Volkov noticed a pattern of deaths among former KGB officers who had served at the alleged Project Zerkalo facility. Within an 18-month period, 7 individuals connected to the project died under circumstances officially ruled as accidents or natural causes. Dmitri Volkov, the pattern was unmistakable. These weren't high-profile assassinations. They were quiet, efficient eliminations of people who knew too much. One drowned in his bathtub. Another had a fatal heart attack despite no history of cardiac issues. A third fell from his apartment balcony. What connected them all was their service record. They had all been posted to the same facility outside Leningrad during the same period in the late 1970s and early 1980s. I tried to interview family members, colleagues, anyone who might have information. Most refused to speak to me. Those who did would only talk in vague terms about their relatives' work involving psychological research or alternative defense mechanisms. One widow told me her husband had nightmares about the shadow that walks through walls until the day he died. Narrator, by 1999, as Putin prepared to succeed Yeltsin as president, Volkov's unofficial investigation had attracted unwanted attention. He was removed from active duty and placed on administrative leave. His apartment was broken into, though nothing of value was taken, but his case notes on the Neva apartment's murders disappeared. He began to notice surveillance, both electronic and physical. Dmitri Volkov, I was followed everywhere. My phone calls were obviously monitored. Colleagues stopped speaking to me. I received anonymous threats telling me to drop my investigation or face consequences. But I was too far in to stop. I had become convinced that whatever killed those men in 1994 had been used in other cases as well. I identified at least 11 deaths between 1992 and 1999 that showed similar unusual characteristics, precise wounds, impossible blood patterns, evidence that made no logical sense. All of the victims had connections to Putin's rise to power, either as early supporters who later fell out of favor or as potential obstacles. None of the cases were ever solved. Most were classified as accidents or attributed to random violence. Narrator in December 1999, just as Vladimir Putin was assuming the role of acting president following Yeltsin's resignation, Volkov made his most alarming discovery yet. Dmitri Volkov, I managed to track down a former guard who had worked at the research facility where Project Zerkalo was allegedly housed. He was dying of cancer and agreed to speak with me, saying he wanted to clear his conscience. What he told me chilled me to the bone. According to this guard, the entity they had manifested wasn't just a weapon, it was sentient. It could think. It could choose its targets. And, most disturbing of all, it required a handler, someone with whom it formed a symbiotic relationship. This handler could direct the entity, but also risked being influenced or even possessed by it. The guard claimed that in the final days before the project was shut down, one young KGB officer had demonstrated an unusual affinity for controlling the entity. That officer was Vladimir Putin. Narrator, this extraordinary claim that the future president of Russia had once been the handler for a paranormal entity used as an assassination tool remains impossible to verify. The guard who provided this information died of his cancer 3 days after speaking with Volkov. His medical records and death certificate subsequently disappeared from hospital files. As Putin consolidated power in the early 2000s, Volkov found his investigation increasingly difficult to pursue. Resources dried up. Contacts refused to speak with him. His personal safety was clearly at risk. Dmitri Volkov, in 2003, I received a package at my apartment. Inside was a single photograph, a crime scene photo I had never seen before, showing the ceiling of Mikhail Baranov's bedroom from the Neva Apartments. The blood symbol was clearly visible, but there was something else. A shadow figure, barely perceptible, seeming to emerge from the symbol itself. The figure had no clear features, just a vaguely humanoid shape, but darker than any natural shadow should be. There was a note with the photo that simply said, "Still watching you." That night, I woke to find my bedroom unnaturally cold. In the corner, I saw what appeared to be a darker patch of shadow, roughly human-shaped. When I turned on the light, there was nothing there. But I knew I had to leave Russia. Narrator Volkov fled to Estonia the following day, eventually making his way to the United Kingdom, where he was granted political asylum. He has lived under an assumed identity ever since. The evidence he managed to preserve, including photographs, notes, and recorded interviews, was entrusted to a network of journalists and researchers with instructions to release it only after his death or under specific circumstances. In 2006, former FSB officer Alexander Litvinenko, who had made public accusations about FSB operations and Putin's rise to power, was poisoned with polonium-210 in London. Before his death, he reportedly reached out to Volkov. Dmitri Volkov Litvinenko contacted me about 3 months before he was poisoned. He said he had information about special operations conducted by a unit within the FSB that aligned with what I had discovered about the Neva Apartments murders. He believed this unit was responsible for eliminations that required plausible deniability and specialized in methods that would appear as accidents or natural causes. We were scheduled to meet in November 2006, but he was poisoned before our meeting could take place. I've often wondered if he had discovered the same truth I had, that behind at least some of the assassinations attributed to Russian intelligence services lay something that defied conventional explanation. Narrator, in the years since, several journalists who have attempted to investigate aspects of the Neva Apartments case or project, Zerkalo, have experienced strange phenomena. Anna Politkovskaya, a prominent Russian journalist known for her criticism of Putin, reportedly was researching unusual deaths connected to Putin's inner circle before her murder in 2006. Her notes on this specific subject were never found. Elena Petrova, I left Russia in 2011 after experiencing what I can only describe as harassment by forces beyond normal explanation. Objects would move in my apartment when I was alone. I would wake to find all my research papers rearranged. Once, I found bloody footprints in my bathroom that matched the unusual pattern from a Neva Apartments crime scene. When I called a colleague to document them, they had vanished by the time he arrived. The scientific part of my mind wants to attribute these experiences to stress or paranoia, but the evidence I've examined from the Neva Apartments case has convinced me that there are phenomena in this world that science, as we understand it, cannot yet explain. Narrator: in March 2019, a former high-ranking member of Russian intelligence who had defected to a Western country provided information to a major news organization about what he called special capabilities within Russian intelligence services. Before the story could be published, the source recanted his entire statement and returned to Russia. The journalist working on the story reported experiencing unusual phenomena in her home: cold spots, shadows moving independently, and electronics malfunctioning, before abruptly abandoning the project. Dmitri Volkov: do I believe that Vladimir Putin personally controls a supernatural entity that he uses to eliminate enemies? When I say it out loud, it sounds absurd, but I've seen the evidence. I've traced the connections. I've experienced things that I cannot explain through conventional understanding of reality. What I believe is this: during the Soviet era, something was discovered or perhaps created in that research facility. Something not entirely of this world. Something that can move through solid matter, attack with precision, and leave evidence that defies physics. Whether you call it a weapon, an entity, or something else entirely, it exists, and someone is controlling it. The truth about the Neva Apartments murders and the other deaths I've connected to them may never be fully revealed. Too much evidence has been destroyed, too many witnesses silenced. But I continue to document everything I find, everything I remember. Because someday, perhaps when Putin is no longer in power and the grip of fear has loosened, the full truth may emerge. Until then, I watch my shadows carefully, especially at night, when sometimes in the corner of my vision, I see darkness move in ways that darkness shouldn't. Narrator: in December 2021, a former FSB officer seeking asylum in France made brief mention of something called the Shadow Program during an initial intelligence debriefing. Before he could elaborate, he complained of feeling suddenly cold. Witnesses reported that he began screaming about a dark figure in the corner of the room, though no one else could see anything unusual. He collapsed and died moments later. The autopsy revealed the cause of death to be a precisely severed carotid artery, despite no visible external wounds and no weapon being found. The case remains unexplained. Elena Petrova's science advances by investigating the unexplained, not by ignoring anomalies. The events at the Neva Apartments and the subsequent pattern of unusual deaths represent a genuine scientific mystery, regardless of the political implications. Something killed those men in 1994, something that operated according to rules we don't yet understand. As a scientist, I cannot definitively say what that something was, but as someone who has examined the evidence firsthand, I can say this: it wasn't human, and I believe it's still active. Narrator: the Neva Apartments building was demolished in 2009 as part of an urban renewal project. Workers reported numerous equipment failures and unexplained accidents during the demolition. 3 workers claimed to have seen a person made of darkness moving through walls at the site. All 3 subsequently left Moscow and could not be located for comment. The site remained vacant for several years before a new government building was constructed there in 2015. Security guards assigned to the building have reported cold spots, electronic malfunctions, and occasionally bloody footprints that appear and then vanish without explanation. In January 2022, a junior staff member working late in the building captured what appears to be a humanoid shadow moving across a wall in security footage. The shadow moves in a direction counter to any possible light source and appears to pass through solid objects. The staff member who discovered the footage was transferred to a remote posting in Siberia the following day. The footage itself was classified and has not been made public. Dmitri Volkov, whatever emerged from Project Zerkalo in the Soviet era, hasn't gone away. It continues to serve whoever controls it, whether that's Putin personally or someone in his inner circle. The old KGB understood the value of fear as a weapon. What could be more terrifying than knowing death could come through your walls at any moment, leaving no evidence, no trail leading back to the perpetrator? In the years I've spent investigating this case, I've come to believe that conventional political analysis misses an important dimension of Putin's power. His opponents don't just fear political defeat or even conventional assassination. At some level, they fear something they can't name, can't fight, can't escape. Sometimes I wonder if the entity itself has grown more powerful over the years, if it's still bound to human control at all. Perhaps what began as a weapon has become something more, a silent partner in power, demanding tribute in the form of lives. Narrator, the full truth about the Neva Apartments murders and their connection to Vladimir Putin's rise to power may never be known. Those who have investigated too deeply have tended to meet unfortunate ends. Official records have been altered or destroyed. Witnesses have disappeared or recanted their testimonies. What remains are fragments, Volkov's preserved evidence, Professor Petrova's analysis, scattered reports of similar phenomena connected to deaths of Putin's opponents over the years. Individually, each piece could be dismissed or explained away. Together, they suggest something that exists at the intersection of political power, advanced science, and perhaps forces beyond conventional understanding. In the shadowy world of Russian power politics, the line between assassination and something more supernatural may be blurrier than we care to acknowledge. And in the darkest corners of the Kremlin, perhaps something watches and waits for its next target, something that moves like a shadow, kills with precision, and leaves no evidence behind. As Volkov continues his life in exile, he maintains vigilance, not just for human assassins, but for a deeper darkness that defies explanation. A darkness that, if his investigation is correct, has helped shape modern Russia from the shadows. You've been listening to The Moscow Shadow, an episode of Beneath the Surface from Stories from the Dark. This program is a work of fiction. Names, characters, places, and incidents are either products of the author's imagination or are used fictitiously. Any resemblance to actual events or locales or persons, living or dead, is entirely coincidental. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe to our channel and share with others who appreciate exploring the mysteries that lie just beneath the surface of our everyday world. Until next time, remember, not every shadow is cast by light.